Carlton, at 39 years old, understood the mechanics of loss. As a transit mechanic for the city of Philadelphia, earning a steady but modest $51,000 a year, he spent his days diagnosing the groans and shudders of machines much larger than himself. He knew the sounds of metal fatigue, of systems under strain, of parts quietly giving up. He did not, however, know how to diagnose the silence that had settled over his wife, Simone, a silence that felt heavier than any broken-down bus. It was a silence that filled their small Kensington Row home, a space they rented for $1,200 a month, its walls covered in the vibrant, hopeful drawings of their 8-year-old son, Jalen. Now that same silence was suffocating him in room 3B of the Sacred Heart Hospice, where the only sound was the rhythmic, labored whisper of his father's breathing. David, his father, was a man built of the same quiet resilience as the city itself. For 40 years, he had driven a SEPTA bus, his deep brown skin luminous under the fluorescent lights of the cabin, his hands steady on the wheel. He'd saved, lived simply, and paid off the stone Tudor in Chestnut Hill, a house now valued at $590,000, a world away from Carlton's reality. And now that world was shrinking to the dimensions of this sterile beige room. It was 5:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, drenched in a cold November rain. Carlton sat on a hard plastic chair, his own calloused hands holding his father's, which felt like a collection of fragile twigs. Across the room, Simone stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that had cost $350, a birthday gift from him that had taken 3 months to pay off. She hadn't touched him or his father since they arrived. "I can't do this," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the hum of the oxygen machine. "I can't just sit in that hospital one more hour, Carlton. It's morbid." Carlton didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on his father's face. "He's dying, Simone." "I know that," she snapped. "I've known that for 6 months. I've sat here. I've done my part. But Jalen is at my sister's, he needs dinner, and I have a blinding headache. This waiting, it's pointless." Her words were like stones dropped into a deep well. He felt the ripples of her impatience, her detachment. For months it had been like this. Every conversation about his father's declining health was met with a sigh, a complaint about the cost of parking at the hospital, or a pivot to their own finances. "We need to be practical," she'd said just last week, spreading their bank statements on their small, $200 IKEA dining table. "With your father gone, there will be expenses and assets." He had no idea how wrong he was about what she truly meant. Now, in this room that smelled of antiseptic and finality, her selfishness was a physical presence. "Go then," he said, his voice a low rumble. He couldn't find the energy to fight. "Finally," she muttered. She grabbed her $800 Michael Kors handbag from the floor. She walked toward the bed, hesitating for a fraction of a second. She looked at the dying man, not with sorrow, but with an expression Carlton couldn't place. It looked like appraisal, like a final calculation. She didn't kiss his father's forehead. She didn't squeeze Carlton's shoulder. "Call me when, she said, and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut at 6:03 p.m. Carlton was alone with his father. He felt the release of a tension he didn't realize he'd been holding. The room felt lighter, cleaner. He leaned his forehead against his father's hand and finally let the tears come. The rain outside streaking down the window pane like a mirror to his own grief. What he didn't know was that Simone wasn't going to her sister's. She wasn't thinking about Jalen's dinner. She was driving her 2018 Nissan Rogue, a car with a $420 monthly payment, directly to a 24-hour copy shop. She had a document in her expensive bag, a document her lawyer had drafted 2 weeks prior. a document she was about to put into motion with a cruelty so precise it was breathtaking. Have you ever felt so completely alone in a room full of people, or even with the one person who is supposed to be your partner? It's a cold, sinking feeling, and Carlton was about to find out just how deep that feeling could go. Let us know in the comments if you've ever had to face a difficult moment without the support you deserved. The hours after Simone left were a blur of sacred quiet. Carlton talked to his father, his voice soft, recounting memories of working on old engines together, of fishing trips on the Schuylkill River, of the day Jalen was born. He held a cool cloth to his father's brow and watched the city lights begin to glitter through the rain-slicked window. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a connection to the man who had taught him everything about integrity and quiet strength. Earlier that day, at 2:11 p.m., something significant had happened. His father had rallied, a brief, startling window of lucidity. His eyes, cloudy for weeks, had cleared. He had looked at Carlton and squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "Get Anya," he'd whispered, his voice raspy. Anya Sharma was his father's estate lawyer, a sharp, kind woman who billed at $1,200 an hour, a fee his father had insisted was an investment in peace. She had arrived within 30 minutes, her briefcase containing a single thick document. "David, are you sure?" she'd asked gently, her voice a calm anchor in the room. His father had nodded, his gaze fixed on Carlton. "A man's real legacy isn't what he owns," David said, his voice gaining a bit of its old timbre. "It's what he protects." With a notary public as a witness, his father had signed the papers. His signature was shaky but clear. It was an irrevocable trust, placing the Chestnut Hill house and his father's entire estate, valued at roughly $750,000, into Carlton's name, effective immediately. The timestamp on the notarized document read 2:11 p.m. It was a final act of protection, a father's last lesson in foresight. At the time, Carlton had been too overwhelmed with emotion to understand the full implication. He thought it was just his father tidying up loose ends. He had no idea it was a shield, forged just in time against a battle he didn't even know was coming. At 11:42 p.m., David's breathing softened, then slowed, then stopped. Carlton was holding his hand. The room went silent, the only sound now the steady drumming of the rain. He stayed there for a long time, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a strange mixture of profound sorrow and deep, abiding love. He finally called Simone at 1:15 a.m. Her voice was thick with sleep, annoyed. "It's over," he said simply. "Oh," she said. There was a pause. "Okay, I'll see you in the morning. Try to get some sleep." The line went dead. "No, I'm sorry." "No, are you okay?" Just the click of a disconnected call, another small, sharp cut in a wound that was growing deeper by the hour. He drove home through the empty, rain-washed streets of Philadelphia in his 2012 Toyota Camry, a car with 187,000 miles on it and a reliable engine he maintained himself. When he walked into their row home, the air was still and cold. A single lamp was on. On the kitchen table, he saw a drawing from Jalen. It was a big, green SEPTA bus. In the driver's seat was a smiling man with a halo, and in one of the windows, another figure was waving. Jalen had written in his shaky 8-year-old script, "Grandpa is driving the Angel bus now." Carlton picked up the drawing, his thumb tracing the crayon lines, and felt a fresh wave of grief wash over him. He sank into a chair, the piece of paper clutched in his hand, and he wept. The next morning was a study in contrasts. The world outside was gray and grieving with him, a persistent drizzle coating everything in a layer of damp sorrow. Inside their home, however, Simone was a whirlwind of brisk, unnerving efficiency. She made coffee, her movements sharp, her face a mask of detached sympathy. "We need to be strong for Jalen," she said, pouring coffee into a $15 ceramic mug. "And we need to be practical. There's a lot to handle now." Carlton, who hadn't slept, just nodded, his mind a fog of exhaustion and loss. He was wearing the same $40 work pants and faded t-shirt he'd had on at the hospice. Simone, meanwhile, was already dressed in a crisp blouse and tailored slacks, an outfit that looked more appropriate for a business meeting than a day of mourning. "I've already made some calls," she continued, not meeting his eyes, "to the funeral home. They need a deposit. And we need to start thinking about the house." "The house?" Carlton asked, his voice hoarse. "Your father's house," she said, a hint of impatience in her tone. "In Chestnut Hill. It's a huge asset, Carlton. We can't just let it sit there. The property taxes alone will be crippling. We need to get it assessed, probably sell it. It could change everything for us." She spoke of his father's home, the place where Carlton had grown up, the yard where he'd learned to throw a baseball, as if it were nothing more than a number on a balance sheet. He felt a small, cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was the same woman who had complained for years about the house's dated kitchen and creepy old furniture. Now it was the centerpiece of her conversation. "I'm not thinking about that right now, Simone," he said quietly. She sighed, a dramatic, put-upon sound. "That's the problem, Carlton. You never think about the future. You're happy to just get by on your mechanic's salary. I want more for us. For Jalen, that house is our ticket." She placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that felt rehearsed and hollow. "Your father would want us to be secure." They had no idea what was coming. Her words were a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide the betrayal she had already set in motion. For the next 2 days, this was the new normal. Carlton moved through a haze of funeral arrangements and condolences from family, his grief a heavy cloak. Simone, on the other hand, was energized. She spent hours on her laptop, looking at real estate websites, talking about market values and closing costs. She bought a new dress online, a $2,400 Burberry piece. "For the funeral," she'd said, though it looked more like something one would wear to a celebratory dinner. Each mention of the house, each dollar sign that flashed in her eyes, felt like a small betrayal, an erosion of the memory of the man who had just passed. He watched her one evening as she stood in their small living room, talking on her phone in a hushed, excited voice. "Yes, a stone Tudor, 6 bedrooms," she was saying. "The comps in the area are amazing. It's a complete game changer." She laughed, a light, airy sound that made Carlton's blood run cold. She was laughing. His father had been gone for less than 72 hours, and she was celebrating. This was the escalating betrayal, the slow, agonizing realization that the woman he had married was a stranger. He saw the condescension in her eyes when she looked at his work-stained hands, the dismissiveness in her voice when he spoke of his father's memory instead of his father's assets, the outrage accumulated in his chest, a silent, growing pressure. He remembered their wedding vows, her promise of in sickness and in health, and felt the bitter sting of hypocrisy. The sickness had come, but she had only seen the opportunity. On Friday morning, 3 days after his father's death, Carlton drove to the Philadelphia County Courthouse. Anya Sharma had called him. "Carlton, you need to come down and file the trust documents and the deed transfer. It's best to get it officially recorded as soon as possible." He walked into the grand, cold building, the original trust document safe in a manila envelope. The air inside was still and smelled of old paper and floor wax. He found the records office, a large room with fluorescent lights humming overhead. He took a number and waited, his worn $89 Timex watch ticking away the minutes. When his number was called, he approached the counter and handed the documents to a clerk. As the clerk was processing the paperwork, Carlton's eyes drifted to a public access computer terminal nearby. On a whim, driven by a flicker of unease he couldn't name, he typed Simone's name into the civil court filing search bar. He expected to find nothing, but there it was. A new filing. A petition for legal separation, filed by Simone Davis. And then he saw the date and time it was filed. Wednesday morning, the morning after his father died. At 8:31 a.m., his heart hammered against his ribs. He felt the blood drain from his face. He clicked on the case number, and the document summary loaded on the screen. He read the words, and the world tilted on its axis. The petition listed their shared assets, which were meager. But then it listed anticipated marital assets, and there it was, spelled out in cold legal language. 50% interest in the real property located at 724 Willow Grove Avenue, Philadelphia, PA, his father's address. An expected inheritance of the respondent, Carlton Davis. She hadn't even waited for his father's body to be cold. She had left his deathbed, and the very next morning she had gone to a lawyer and filed a legal claim on the house she assumed he would inherit. Her departure from the hospice, her headache, her concern for Jalen, it was all a lie. A cover story for the first step in her meticulously planned financial strike. He stood there staring at the screen, the clerk's voice a distant buzz in his ears. The date on the filing was the key. 8:31 a.m., Wednesday. Hours after his father had passed, but also, crucially, hours after his father had signed the irrevocable trust. The trust that had been executed at 2:11 p.m. on Tuesday. At that moment, the grief in his heart was eclipsed by a cold, clear, and absolute certainty. The woman he had loved was gone. In her place was a predator who had seen his family's deepest moment of pain as her golden opportunity, and she had just made a critical mistake. Carlton walked out of the courthouse and into the weak afternoon sunlight. The city felt different, its edges sharper, its colors muted. He sat in his old Camry, the engine off, and held the steering wheel with trembling hands. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, it was almost elegant in its cruelty. He felt a wave of nausea, then a surge of anger so pure and cold it felt like ice water in his veins. He did not drive home. He did not call Simone. His first instinct was to scream, to confront her, to throw her own treachery in her face. But then he thought of his father's last words. A man's real legacy isn't what he owns, it's what he protects. His father hadn't just been talking about the house. He was talking about Jalen. He was talking about dignity. A confrontation would be messy. It would be loud. Jalen would hear it. It would accomplish nothing but to give Simone the satisfaction of a fight. No. His father was a quiet man who planned ahead. Carlton would honor him by doing the same. This would not be a war of words. It would be a war of paperwork, a war of timestamps. His first call was to Anya Sharma. He explained what he had found, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Anya spoke, her voice laced with a mixture of sympathy and steel. Carlton, I am so sorry. I've seen a lot of things in my practice, but this is exceptionally predatory. What does it mean? He asked. Her filing. It means she's a fool, Anya said. And for the first time, Carlton felt a flicker of something other than pain. She filed a claim on an asset that at the time of her filing, you did not possess and were not legally entitled to inherit. At 8:31 a.m. on Wednesday, the property at 724 Willow Grove Avenue was all ready and had been for 18 hours, the sole property of the David C. Davis Irrevocable Trust, of which you are the sole trustee and beneficiary. Her claim is on an expectation. The law, however, deals in reality. The plan began to form piece by piece during that phone call. It was simple, elegant, and devastating. Step 1. Strategic restraint. He would go home and act as if nothing had happened. He would play dumb. He would let Simone believe her plan was proceeding perfectly. Step 2. Evidence. He would let her talk. He would listen to her plans for the house, her dreams of a new life funded by his father's legacy, and he would mentally record every word. Step 3. The strike. Anya would handle everything. She would file a motion to dismiss Simone's petition. She would serve Simone's lawyer. It would be quiet, professional, and final. She won't see it coming, Anya promised. Her own lawyer will be the one to tell her that her entire case is built on sand. The cost for this legal maneuver would be around $5,000, money that would come from the trust. It felt like a small price to pay for justice. When Carlton finally got home that evening, the house felt like a stage set. Simone was in the kitchen, humming as she scrolled through her phone. Jalen was on the living room floor, meticulously coloring in the bus drawing he'd made. "Hey, honey," Simone said, looking up with a bright, false smile. "How was your day?" "It was fine," Carlton said, his voice even. "Just ran some errands." He sat on the floor with Jalen, his back to Simone. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion he could finally let show. "That's a beautiful bus." Jalen pointed with a brown crayon, the color he'd used for the figures in the window. "That's you, Daddy, and that's me. We're black, like Grandpa was. He's waving to us from heaven." Carlton hugged his son, burying his face in the boy's soft coils, inhaling the scent of crayons and childhood. This was what he was protecting. Over Jalen's small shoulder, he could see Simone at the kitchen counter. She was on a website for high-end furniture. She was decorating a house she would never set foot in. The cold tension in the room was a living thing. He was dying inside, but on the outside, he was just a father, admiring his son's art. The days that followed were the hardest of Carlton's life. He was living a lie, playing the part of the grieving, oblivious husband. Each interaction with Simone was a masterclass in self-control. Every meal they shared felt like a scene from a play, where only he knew the final act. One evening, she sat beside him on their worn, $400 sofa, a tablet in her hand. "I was looking at some things for the house," she began, her tone casual. She swiped through images of sleek, minimalist kitchens, stainless steel appliances worth $15,000, marble countertops that would cost another $10,000. "Your father's kitchen is so dark, we'd need to knock down that wall, open it all up. It would really increase the resale value." "Mm-hmm," Carlton said, his eyes fixed on the basketball game on their old 32-inch television. Inside, he was cataloging her words. Resale value. Not our home, not a place for Jalen to grow up. "And the garden," she went on, oblivious. "It's a mess. We could put in a beautiful stone patio, maybe an outdoor kitchen. It would be perfect for entertaining." He thought of his father's gnarled hands covered in dirt, lovingly tending his tomato plants and rose bushes. He remembered spending entire summer afternoons out there with him. "Perfect," Carlton said, his voice flat. He felt nothing. It was a terrifying and liberating sensation. Another lie came a day later. Her sister called, and he overheard Simone's end of the conversation. "Oh, he's just devastated, of course," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. "He can barely function. I'm having to handle everything, all the financial stuff. It's a huge burden, but someone has to be the strong one." He stood in the hallway listening and felt a profound sense of pity for her. She was so convinced of her own cleverness, so certain of his ignorance. She had underestimated him completely, assuming the quiet mechanic was a simple man, easily manipulated. That was the core of her downfall. She saw his grief as weakness, not as a source of quiet, resolute strength. The most galling performance was the night before the funeral. She came to him, her eyes soft, and took his hand. "I know this is so hard," she whispered, "but I want you to know we're going to get through this. Once we sell the house and get on our feet, everything will be better. A fresh start. For us." She was talking about a future that didn't exist, a future built on a foundation of lies and a timestamp that had already rendered her plans obsolete. He looked into her eyes and saw only the reflection of her own ambition. He simply nodded. "Okay, Simone." Each lie was a scene, and with each scene, his resolve hardened. He wasn't just doing this for himself, or even for his father's memory. He was doing it for Jalen. He was drawing a clear, bright line between the world of integrity his father had built and the world of deceit Simone was trying to create. The day of the funeral was the final act of her charade. She wore the $2,400 Burberry dress, a slash of expensive beige in a sea of somber black. She stood by his side at the cemetery, holding his arm, accepting condolences with a sad, noble expression on her face. To the world, she was the grieving, supportive daughter-in-law. To Carlton, she was a ghost, a specter at a feast she thought was being held in her honor. As the minister spoke of David's legacy of kindness and hard work, Carlton looked at his wife and felt the last vestiges of his love for her turn to dust and blow away on the cold November wind. Do you think it's possible for someone to change? Or are some betrayals so deep that they reveal a person's true, unchangeable character? The line between protecting yourself and seeking revenge can be thin, but for Carlton, it was becoming clearer every day. He wasn't seeking revenge, he was simply enforcing a consequence. The day of the strike was a Monday, 6 days after the funeral. It was a bright, cold morning. Carlton dropped Jalen off at school, giving him an extra long hug at the gate. "I love you, buddy. Be good." "Love you too, Daddy," Jalen said, his backpack with a cartoon bus on it bouncing as he ran to join his friends. Carlton went to work, the familiar smells of grease and diesel a comfort. He put on his work clothes and submerged himself in the tangible reality of a transmission repair. He replaced a faulty solenoid pack, his hands moving with the practiced ease of years. He was fixing something broken, making it whole again. It felt right. At 10 a.m., Anya Sharma sent a single text message to him. "It's done." At 10:02 a.m., a process server, a nondescript man in a worn jacket, walked into Glamour Nails, the salon where Simone was treating herself to a $90 gel manicure. He walked up to her station, confirmed her name, and handed her a thick envelope. "You've been served," he said, and walked out. At 10:05 a.m., an email with multiple PDF attachments landed in the inbox of Arthur Vance, Simone's divorce attorney, a man whose slick downtown office cost her a $15,000 retainer. The email was from Anya Sharma. The subject line was simple: "Motion to dismiss and supporting documents R.E. Davis versus Davis." The attachments contained everything: a copy of the fully executed and notarized irrevocable trust, time-stamped 2:11 p.m. Tuesday, a copy of the deed of transfer filed with the county on Friday, and a 2-page motion to dismiss Simone's separation petition on the grounds that her central claim on an anticipated inheritance was moot, as the asset in question was legally transferred to a trust prior to the death of the grantor and prior to her filing. Carlton could picture the scene perfectly. Simone, sitting in the salon chair, her nails half finished, her face a mask of confusion, as she tore open the envelope. The other patrons stealing glances. The humiliation creeping into her cheeks. He could picture Arthur Vance, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, opening the email with a sigh, expecting a standard response. He would see the trust. He would see the timestamp. He would feel a jolt of professional shock, followed by cold, hard anger. Anger at his own client for omitting such a critical piece of information, for making him look like a fool, for wasting his time on a case that was dead on arrival. The first call from Simone came at 10:17 a.m. Carlton was wiping his hands on a rag, the transmission job complete. He let it go to voicemail. The second call came at 10:22 a.m. He ignored it. The third, fourth, and fifth calls came in rapid succession. He let them all go. He knew he had to listen to the voicemails later. They were part of the evidence, the final chapter of the story. At 11:30 a.m., his phone rang again. It was an unfamiliar number. He answered it. "Mr. Davis, this is Arthur Vance," a clipped, irritated voice said. "I represent your wife, Simone Davis." "I know who you are," Carlton said calmly. There was a pause. "Mr. Davis, I've just received a motion from your legal counsel. Is it your position that this trust document is valid?" "It was signed by my father in the presence of his lawyer and a notary public. He was of sound mind. So, yes, it's valid." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Did my client, your wife, have any knowledge of this trust prior to her filing?" "You'd have to ask her," Carlton said. "But I can tell you she left my father's deathbed at 6 p.m. that evening because she couldn't stand to be in the hospital. The trust was signed 4 hours before that. You do the math." Another, longer pause. The sound of shuffling papers. "I see, mister," Vance said, his voice now devoid of all bluster. "Mr. Davis, thank you for your time." The line went dead. The great Arthur Vance, whose website boasted of his aggressive litigation style, had just folded his hand without playing a single card. He knew he had nothing. Carlton went back to work. He felt a quiet, profound sense of release. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't joy. It was the calm, clean feeling of a job well done. The feeling of a broken thing made right. The antagonist's world was beginning to collapse. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, rustling sound of legal papers proving she had been outmaneuvered by a piece of paper signed by a dying man who loved his son. That evening, Carlton picked up Jalen and they went to a cheap pizza place, a local spot with red checkered tablecloths and a jukebox. He didn't want to go home yet. He wanted to give his son a moment of pure, uncomplicated normalcy. As Jalen chattered on about his day, his face smeared with tomato sauce, Carlton finally listened to the voicemails from Simone. He put one earbud in, keeping the other ear free to listen to his son. The messages were a perfect textbook progression of an antagonist's collapse. Voicemail 1, 10:17 a.m., confused, annoyed. "Carlton, what is this? Some guy just came into the salon and gave me papers. It's embarrassing. My lawyer is supposed to handle this stuff. Call me. This is ridiculous." Voicemail 2, 10:45 a.m., angry, panicked. "I just spoke to Arthur. A trust? What trust? Your father couldn't have signed anything. He was out of his mind. This is a trick, Carlton. It's illegal. You can't do this. That house is half mine. We will fight this." Voicemail 3, 11:50 a.m., horrified, voice cracking. "Arthur called me back. He explained it." The timestamp. "Oh my God, Carlton. He signed it before he died? Before I even left the hospital? You knew. You knew this whole time. You sat there and watched me. You let me plan. What did you do?" Voicemail 4, 1:30 p.m. Pleading, desperate. "Carlton, please, please just call me. We can talk about this. Maybe we were too hasty. I've been under so much stress with your father's death and everything. I wasn't thinking clearly. We can tear up the papers, all of them. We can still be a family. Think about Jalen. Voicemail 5, 3:15 p.m. Sobbing, incoherent. A long message of weeping, broken phrases. My whole life, everything gone. How could you be so cruel? I loved you. He deleted them one by one. Her words meant nothing. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. She didn't miss her family. She missed the $590,000 house. The mention of Jalen was the most cynical ploy of all, a last-ditch effort to use their son as a shield after her plan to exploit a dead man had failed. When he and Jalen got home, Simone was there. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face puffy. The expensive clothes and confident air were gone. She looked small and defeated. "We need to talk," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "There's nothing to talk about," Carlton said, steering Jalen toward his bedroom. "Go get your pajamas on, buddy." Once Jalen was out of earshot, Carlton turned to face her. He felt a vast, empty calm. "How could you?" she wept. "How could you be so cold? So methodical?" Carlton looked at her, and for the first time he spoke the truth that had been sitting in his heart for a week. He used the callback technique, repeating her own words back to her, not with anger, but with devastating quiet. "You want to talk about cold and methodical, Simone? Is it methodical to leave your husband's side while his father is dying because you find it morbid? Is it methodical to drive straight from a hospice to a copy shop? Is it methodical to file a separation agreement at 8:31 the next morning, laying claim to a house that belonged to a man whose death you didn't even stay to witness?" Her face went white. Every word was a hammer blow, a reflection of her own actions. She stammered, "I deserved something for all the years I put in." "You deserved a husband who loved you and a son who adored you," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You had that. And you decided it wasn't as valuable as a stone house in Chestnut Hill. You made a bet, Simone. You bet that my father's house was worth more than your family, and you lost." He walked past her and went to help Jalen with his pajamas. The conversation was over. Her world had not just collapsed. He had forced her to look at the rubble she herself had created. The consequences cascaded quickly, a series of quiet, administrative blows that dismantled Simone's life as she had planned it. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown. There was only the cold, efficient machinery of the law confirming her failure. First, the legal downfall. Her lawyer, Arthur Vance, filed a motion to withdraw from her case, citing irreconcilable differences and the fact that his client had failed to disclose material information. The court granted it immediately. Her petition for separation, now baseless, was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could not file it again. Her $15,000 retainer was gone, spent on a few hours of work for a case that was invalid from the start. She was left with nothing but her own legal bills, which amounted to another $2,500 for services rendered. Second, the financial ruin. The divorce proceeded, but on Carlton's terms, handled cleanly and quietly by Anya Sharma. The division of assets was simple because there was so little to divide. The Kensington Row home was a rental. They simply broke the lease. The 2012 Toyota Camry was sold for its Kelley Blue Book value of $6,900. She got a check for half, $3,450. Their joint savings account contained $4,280. Her half was $2,140. All told, Simone walked away from a decade of marriage with a grand total of $5,590. It was not enough to fund a life of luxury. It was barely enough for the first month's rent and security deposit on a small, one-bedroom apartment in a less desirable neighborhood, a place that cost $1,400 a month. The $2,400 Burberry dress she'd bought for the funeral hung in her new, cramped closet, a bitter reminder of the wealth she had tasted only in her imagination. Third, the social collapse. News travels fast. Her friends, the ones she'd been boasting to about her impending windfall, suddenly grew distant. The calls stopped. The invitations to brunch dried up. They had been attracted to her prospective wealth, and without it, they found her company far less compelling. Her own family, particularly her sister, was mortified by her actions. The story of her leaving the hospice to file court papers became a source of deep shame. She was isolated, her social circle shrinking to the size of her tiny new apartment. Finally, there was the personal consequence, the one Carlton hadn't anticipated, but which felt the most just. In the custody arrangement, Jalen would spend weekends and holidays with him. During one of their first weekends apart, Jalen came home with a drawing. It was of two houses. One was a big, beautiful stone house, with a garden and a sun shining over it. He'd labeled it Daddy's house. The other was a small square building with one window and a rain cloud over it. He'd labeled it Mommy's apartment. It was a child's simple, devastatingly honest mirror of the new reality. Simone's grand plan, her scheme for a life of comfort and status, had resulted in her being drawn under a rain cloud by her own son. The contrast was stark. The $590,000 tutor she had coveted was now the warm, loving home for the family she had abandoned, while she was left with a cheap apartment and the consequences of her own choices. 6 months passed. Spring arrived in Philadelphia, breathing life back into the city. Carlton and Jalen moved into the house in Chestnut Hill. The first few weeks were strange. The space felt enormous, filled with the ghosts of his parents' quiet life, but slowly, with Jalen's laughter echoing in the hallways, it began to feel like home. Carlton didn't sell it. He kept his job as a transit mechanic, finding comfort in the familiar work. The trust provided a comfortable cushion, paying the property taxes and allowing him to make repairs, but he wanted Jalen to grow up knowing the value of a day's work, the dignity of a steady paycheck. The house was not a monument to wealth, it was a sanctuary of love. They tackled the overgrown garden together. Carlton showed Jalen how to till the soil, just as his own father had shown him. They planted tomato seedlings and marigolds. They found his mother's old rose bushes, choked with weeds, and carefully pruned them back to health. As the first buds appeared, Carlton felt a sense of growth and renewal that had nothing to do with money. His father had left one other thing in the garage, tucked under a dusty tarp. It was the shell of a 1968 GMC Transit bus, the same model he had driven for the first decade of his career. It had been his passion project, a retirement dream he never got to finish. That became Carlton's project. Every Saturday, he and Jalen would work on the bus. Carlton would be underneath, wrench in hand, explaining the function of a drive shaft or a brake line. Jalen would sit in the driver's seat, his small hands on the giant steering wheel, pretending to drive routes through the city. They sanded down the old paint, revealing the strong steel underneath. They ordered parts online, using money from the trust. A new engine for $4,000. A set of vintage seats for $1,500. It was more than restoring a bus. It was restoring a legacy. It was connecting his son to the grandfather he barely knew, through the shared language of mechanics and motion. Jalen's drawings, which now covered the huge refrigerator in the dated kitchen, were almost all of the bus. He drew pictures of the three of them, Carlton, himself, and Grandpa David as an angel in the passenger seat, driving through a sun-drenched Germantown. One afternoon, Simone came by. It was the first time she had seen the house since the move. She stood on the flagstone walkway, looking thin and tired. Her car was an older model, a 10-year-old Hyundai. "It looks good," she said, her eyes on the blooming rose bushes. The garden. We've been working on it, Carlton said. He felt no anger, no bitterness. He felt only a distant sort of sadness for the choices she had made. Carlton, I'm sorry, she said, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. I was wrong. I messed everything up. It was a too-late apology, offered not for his comfort, but for her own. He nodded, accepting it not for her, but for himself. Forgiveness was a gift you gave yourself, a way of putting down a heavy bag you'd been carrying. I hope you find what you're looking for, Simone. It was a quiet, final meeting. There was no rage, only a peaceful finality. He had his father's house, but more importantly, he had his father's integrity. He had Jalen. He was building a new life, not on a foundation of assets, but on a foundation of love, hard work, and the rumbling promise of an old bus being brought back to life. True wealth isn't something you can inherit or seize in a moment of opportunism. It's not measured by the square footage of a house or the balance in a bank account. Real wealth is built slowly, over time. It's in the calloused hands that fix what is broken, in the patience that nurtures a garden back to life, in the love that protects a child's future. It's the legacy of character you leave behind, a quiet strength that can outlast any legal document, any selfish scheme. It's the sound of a child's laughter in a home filled with memories, and the shared joy of bringing a piece of the past roaring back to life, ready for the journey ahead. What Carlton's father left him wasn't just a house, it was a lesson. And it was a lesson Carlton would spend the rest of his life passing on to his son, on long weekend rides through the beautiful, resilient streets of their city. Thank you for joining us on Love Beyond Pride. If this story of quiet strength and earned justice resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories about overcoming betrayal and finding true happiness.